August 12, 2021. Somewhere in the state of Utah, a white van is driving along a desert highway. Inside, two people are traveling. One of them is recording. The other seems nervous, tense, disconnected. Minutes earlier, a police patrol had pulled the vehicle over. The scene was recorded on a body camera, and what that recording shows will, over time, become one of the most analyzed fragments on the internet. The couple is arguing. The tension is evident. The police intervene. They ask questions. They observe the behavior. They try to understand what is happening within that relationship. But at that moment, no one knows that this van is part of something much bigger. A road trip across the United States. A story shared on social media. A life that, from the outside, seemed perfect. And a disappearance that would occur a few weeks later. Because the young woman who appears in that scene is named Gabby Petito. And after that encounter with the police, someone would stop seeing her alive. For days, weeks, even months afterward, millions of people would try to reconstruct what happened between that moment and her disappearance. Analyzing videos, messages, social media posts, and every available fragment of a trip that, little by little, began to fall apart. But to understand how we got here, we have to start from the beginning. Before becoming the center of an international investigation, Gabby Petito was a 22-year-old young woman with a life that, from the outside, seemed headed toward something quite common. She had grown up in New York. She had family, friends, and a romantic relationship with a boy named Laundrie. Like many young couples, they shared plans, projects, and the idea of building something together. But in 2021, they made a decision that would completely change the course of their lives. They decided to take a trip across the United States in a van. A van life trip. The idea was simple: travel through national parks, live nomadically for months, and document the trip on social media. On Instagram and other platforms, the image they projected was very specific. Open roads, natural landscapes, smiles, seemingly peaceful moments. The white van became their home, their means of transport, and also their public stage. Because a large part of what they did, they not only lived but also shared. However, as happens in many cases of this type, the public image does not always reflect the complete reality. As the trip progressed, signs began to appear that, viewed in retrospect, have been the subject of subsequent analysis. Small tensions, intermittent posts, changes in the tone of the messages. But at that moment, none of that was visible to the general public. What was seen from the outside was a young couple traveling across the country, enjoying the freedom of the road. The turning point began to form during their journey through the western United States. Between national parks, impromptu stops, and long road trips, life inside the van became the absolute center of their daily existence. There was no escape. There was no distance. Only the interior of the vehicle and the relationship between the two. And in that closed environment, the dynamic between Gabby and Brian began to become more complex. This is something that would later be analyzed based on testimonies, records, and, especially, a key element that would appear later: a police intervention on the road. But at this point in the story, there was still no public alarm. Only a trip that was following its course. A van crossing the country. And a couple trying to build a nomadic life that, from the outside, seemed like a dream. Until August 12, 2021, that trip crossed paths with a police patrol in Utah. And from that moment on, the story stopped being just a trip, and it became an investigation. On August 12, 2021, a 911 call alerts the authorities in the Moab area, Utah. A witness has reported an unusual situation on the road. Describes an argument, a vehicle driving erratically, and a possible altercation between its occupants. Shortly after, a local patrol locates the van mentioned in the notice. It is the same white van associated with Gabby Petito and her partner, Laundrie. They pull them over, and one of the most analyzed moments of the case begins. The police body cameras record the entire interaction, from the first contact to the conversation inside and outside the vehicle. The first thing that draws attention is Gabby's emotional state. She is seen crying, visibly upset, breathing with difficulty. The officers try to calm the situation and understand what happened. They ask her questions. They ask her to explain what happened. She describes an argument with Brian. She talks about tension, about anxiety, about a moment of emotional crisis during the trip. Meanwhile, Brian appears calmer in his outward behavior, although the situation as a whole clearly shows a relationship under pressure. The officers try to evaluate what happened from a domestic conflict perspective. It is not yet a disappearance, but rather an episode of violence or tension between a couple on the road. After an evaluation on the spot, the officers decide to separate them temporarily for the night. Gabby remains with the van. Brian is taken to a nearby hotel. The decision is not interpreted at that moment as the beginning of a larger case. It is an isolated intervention within a conflict situation. But over time, this police stop would become one of the most debated points of the entire investigation. Because after that encounter, the dynamics of the trip change. Social media begins to show less activity. Posts become more spaced out. And the general tone of the content begins to vary. The trip continues. But something is no longer the same. Days later, the van is seen again driving through different states in the western United States. But at some point in the journey, Gabby's presence ceases to be documented clearly. And there comes a time when there is no longer any contact with her family. Without explanations. Without coherent messages. Without verifiable activity. Worry begins to grow slowly. First as a doubt. Then as an alarm. And finally as a disappearance. But at that moment, still no one knows for sure what has happened. There is only one last clear scene in the minds of those following the case. A white van. An open road. And a story that is about to fall apart completely. At the end of August 2021, the image of the trip begins to fragment. The white van associated with Gabby Petito continues to appear in different parts of the western United States, but there is no longer a clear narrative to accompany it. There are no consistent posts. There are no regular updates. And, above all, there is no longer verifiable communication with those close to her. For her family, the first indication is not official news. It is something much more mundane. A silence. Messages that do not receive a response. Calls that go unanswered. And an absence of activity that begins to appear anomalous for someone who, until then, was very present in digital life. On September 11, 2021, the concern has already turned into certainty. Gabby is not in contact, and there is no clear explanation for her whereabouts. Her family reports her missing to the authorities. From that moment on, the case is no longer a private concern, and it becomes an active investigation. Law enforcement begins to collect information on her last known movements. Records are reviewed. Locations are analyzed. Traffic cameras and travel data are studied. But there is a central problem from the beginning. The main travel companion, Brian Laundrie, is no longer immediately locatable. His whereabouts are uncertain, and his cooperation with the investigation quickly becomes one of the key points of the case. Meanwhile, media attention grows. The story begins to spread on social media, and the case acquires a national dimension in the United States. The combination of factors is explosive. A trip documented on social media. A missing young woman. A van that has been seen in multiple locations. And an incomplete chronology that leaves too many spaces unexplained. In that context, every new detail becomes an object of public analysis. Every image. Every testimony. Every fragment of information. But at this initial stage, there are still no answers. Only an increasingly evident absence. And an investigation that tries to reconstruct, step by step, what happened after the last moment Gabby was seen alive. The next step will be decisive. Because attention will stop focusing solely on the disappearance. And will begin to turn toward the person who was with her during the trip. When Gabby Petito's disappearance becomes official, the investigation takes an immediate turn toward the person who was sharing the trip with her, Brian Laundrie. In the first moments, his role is not fully defined within the police process. He is not, officially, a suspect. But he is one of the last people who was with Gabby. And that makes him a key figure from the beginning. Authorities try to locate him to obtain his version of events. However, a major problem soon arises. Brian is not available for questioning, and his family indicates they do not know exactly where he is at the moment. This lack of contact adds a layer of complexity to the case, because the investigation no longer focuses solely on finding Gabby. Now it also involves determining what happened in the days after she was last seen. Meanwhile, public attention grows exponentially. Social media begins to play an unexpected role in the development of the case. Users review old posts. They analyze photographs. They try to reconstruct the chronology of the trip from digital fragments. The case becomes a media phenomenon. But in parallel, the official investigation proceeds with more caution. Vehicle movements are reviewed, locations are analyzed, and an attempt is made to establish a precise timeline of the last known days. In the midst of this process, Brian ceases to be actively located by the authorities during a critical period. And shortly after, his family communicates that he has disappeared. This situation causes an important change in the direction of the case. Because now the investigation has two fronts: determining Gabby's whereabouts and locating the last person who was with her. The case enters an expanded search phase, with federal resources, with the participation of multiple agencies, and with growing media pressure that follows every move in detail. Meanwhile, the public image of the case begins to consolidate around a central idea: a trip that ended abruptly, and an absence that needs explanation. But fundamental pieces are still missing, and those pieces will soon appear, because the van will be located, and with it, an important part of the story will begin to fit together. As the investigation advances, attention centers on a key element of the case: the white van associated with Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. It is not just a vehicle. It is practically the last physical thread connecting the investigation to what happened during the trip. Authorities begin to track its movements in the days after Gabby's last known communication. And finally, on September 1, 2021, the van is located in Florida. It was in the possession of Brian Laundrie's family. This finding significantly changes the direction of the case. Because from that moment on, the investigation is no longer based solely on testimonies or messages. Now there is a physical object that can be analyzed. A vehicle that was present in the last days of the trip. However, at that moment, there is still no definitive answer regarding Gabby's whereabouts. The uncertainty continues. Meanwhile, media pressure increases. The case has already transcended the local level and has become a nationwide and international investigation. Social media amplifies every new detail, and public opinion begins to demand answers with greater intensity. Shortly after, searches are intensified in natural areas where it is believed Gabby could have been: national parks, forest areas, and remote areas of the western United States. It is a broad, complex search with multiple open fronts. In this context, the investigation remains in a critical phase, because there is still no confirmation of Gabby's fate. And every day that passes, the uncertainty about what happened increases. However, what is about to happen will completely change the tone of the case. Because weeks after her disappearance, the discovery that will put an end to part of the mystery occurs, but will open another, even more complex one. On September 19, 2021, authorities confirmed the discovery of human remains in the Grand Teton National Park area in Wyoming. The search, which for weeks had covered multiple states and natural areas, finally finds a concrete reference point. The remains are subsequently identified as belonging to Gabby Petito. With this confirmation, the investigation moves from a missing person phase to a death investigation phase. The finding closes a fundamental part of the case, but opens another much more complex one. Because now the question is no longer where Gabby is, but what exactly happened in the days leading up to her death. The location of the discovery becomes a key point for the investigators. The surroundings are analyzed, the terrain conditions are reviewed, and an attempt is made to reconstruct how she could have gotten there. Meanwhile, media attention reaches its highest point. The case is already followed internationally, and every new detail is interpreted by a global audience that has been following the story since its first signs. Shortly after the discovery, the official identification is made, and the authorities confirm that it is a homicide. This point marks a definitive change in the nature of the case. The investigation ceases to be a missing person search, and becomes a criminal investigation. In parallel, Brian Laundrie's figure acquires even greater relevance within the process, because he is still not immediately locatable, and his absence makes him a central piece of the investigation. Authorities intensify their search, while public opinion follows every update with enormous attention. The case, which began as a trip shared on social media, has ended up becoming a nationwide criminal investigation. And there are still fundamental questions to answer. Among them, one of the most important. What exactly happened between the last time Gabby was seen alive and the moment her story came to an end? After the confirmation of Gabby Petito's death, the investigation focuses almost exclusively on locating Brian Laundrie. His whereabouts become a priority for the authorities, not only because of his relationship to the case, but because he could provide key information about what happened in the final days of the trip. For weeks, The search intensifies in different natural areas of the state of Florida. Wooded areas, trails, protected reserves. The terrain is complex and extensive, which hinders the progress of the investigation. Meanwhile, the case has already reached global repercussions. Media outlets from all over the world follow every update, and public interest remains constant. Finally, on October 20, 2021, the authorities confirm a finding in the Carlton Reserve in Florida. Human remains associated with Brian Laundrie are found in that area. Next to them, a notebook is located. The content of that notebook becomes a relevant piece within the investigation. The authorities analyze it as part of the process to try to reconstruct the last days of the case. Over time, the official investigation concludes that Brian Laundrie was involved in Gabby Petito's death, and that he subsequently took his own life. With this conclusion, the case enters its closing phase. The main chronology is established: a road trip, a relationship under pressure, a previous police intervention, a disappearance, a discovery, and an investigation that ends up pointing to a tragedy within a couple dynamic. However, even with the case closed from a legal point of view, questions remain that cannot be completely resolved. Because not everything can be reconstructed with total precision. Not all moments have witnesses, and not all decisions are recorded. What does remain clear is the contrast between the public image of the trip and the reality that was unfolding inside the van. A life shared on social media, and a private story that ended irreversibly. The Gabby Petito case is not understood only as a criminal investigation. It is also understood as a media phenomenon. A case where social media played an active role in reconstructing the facts, and where millions of people followed the story almost in real time. But behind the global attention, there was a much simpler and much more tragic reality. A young woman, a trip, and a story that ended too soon. The rest is what always happens afterward. Questions, analysis, and the constant search to understand how a story that began as a dream ended up becoming an international investigation case.